Hey there. Tonight we're stepping back, not into tales of kings, crowns, or knights in shining armor, but into the real Middle Ages. For the next 6 hours, you'll find yourself in a world of peasants and rulers, castles and plagues, a world where the goal isn't to conquer, but simply to survive. These are the moments history books usually skip: the dirt under your nails, the hunger in your stomach, the sounds that fill the air, and the silences that follow. Life, not as a knight or noble, but as one of the countless others. You'll till the fields, obey the lords, and hope you don't die from your own supper, or from one wrong step in one unlucky century. If slow, gentle history helps you unwind, then settle in. Like the video and subscribe if it truly brings you some peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting in knowing others are falling asleep to the same quiet world. So, dim the lights. Let your mind ease into stillness, and let's begin. This village has no name, or if it did, no one remembers it anymore. It rests in a shallow valley, tucked somewhere in the middle of nowhere, a soft fold of land, far enough from roads and records to escape the notice of kings. You wouldn't find it on any map, not that you've ever seen one. To you, the world simply ends where the trees begin. The forest looms at the edges, ancient, patient, and heavy, as if it's only tolerating your presence. The fields spread out in ragged patches of green and brown, worked until there's nothing left in you, and then worked again. Somewhere to the north, there's a river. You've never seen it, but you've heard about it in the same hushed way people might speak of saints or monsters. This is where you were born. This is where you'll die. Perhaps no more than 60 steps separate the two. The homes lean and sag as though too many winters have pressed against them. The walls are made of wattle and daub, mud, straw, and sticks woven together, patched again and again with whatever's left after the weather takes its share. The thatched roofs bow under their own weight, always dripping from spots you can't quite fix. The village smells of damp wool, smoke, and soil. A sharp bite of livestock, a whisper of rot, but you barely notice anymore. It's just the scent of living here. The road leading in isn't much of a road at all, just a muddy track worn by ox carts, their grooves deep enough to hold rainwater and mosquitoes. No important traveler has passed this worry in years, maybe ever. Most days slip by quietly. If the wind is right, you'll hear the distant toll of a chapel bell from a neighboring village. Otherwise, you mark time by the sun's path, the stretching shadows, or the dull ache that sets into your back before noon. Perhaps a dozen families live here, enough to gather on feast days. Everyone knows everyone else, and everyone knows each other's troubles. Most are politely ignored until they can't be anymore. The closest thing to a leader is an elder named Tom. His claim to wisdom is a single conversation he once had with a monk, a story he repeats often enough that no one dares question it. His hut still stands, his goat still thrives, and that seems proof enough. Out here, nothing is precise. There are no written records here, no deeds, no surveys, no parchment to prove who owns what. Boundaries are measured in memories, past the old elm tree, or where the ground turns soft underfoot. If people argue over land, it rarely lasts long. A few words, maybe a raised voice, and often a loaf of bread passed between hands, until no one has the energy to keep fighting. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. A stranger arriving is so rare that it becomes the subject of gossip for weeks. Where did they come from? What are they after? Are they cursed? Do they carry the smell of the sea? Someone new is both exciting and unsettling, and no one here ever truly leaves. Travel isn't a plan, it's a rumor. You've heard whispers of towns, of cities, of places where stone buildings climb 2 or even 3 stories high. But those sound more like fairy tales, like talking animals, or women who turn into birds. How can you miss a world you've never laid eyes on? The forest is too thick, the hills too long, and the roads, if you can even call them roads, are better known for bandits and bad luck than safe arrivals. And if you did reach some faraway town, what then? You don't know the dialect. You have no coin. You don't know their ways. You don't even know your own age. So you stay, because staying is safer, even when it's hard, even when it's dull, even when the roof leaks, the well runs low, and the same pot of stew bubbles for 3 straight days. There's a strange comfort in repetition, knowing exactly where the firewood is stacked, who to ask when your fence gives out, or which patch of sky tells you it's time to bring in the sheep. You wake when the light comes. You sleep when it fades. You work in between. It isn't much, but it is life. And inside its quiet rhythm, there's a kind of peace, a peace that doesn't ask questions, that doesn't reach beyond the view from the top of the nearest hill. Every so often, you might hear whispers of a distant war, a king's death, or a comet that frightened a village 5 days' walk from here. But the news never arrives whole. It trickles down, carried by too many mouths, losing weight and urgency, somewhere between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time feels different here. The seasons don't change cleanly. They blur together. A damp spring softens into a wet summer. A sharp frost deepens into a winter that eats through your boots. You don't measure years. You measure harvests, dry ones, wet ones. The terrible year when the rye blackened with rot. The good year when the barley grew thick and heavy, and even old Marjorie smiled for a week straight. Sometimes the steward comes through. He collects grain, asks a few questions, scratches notes onto a page. You answer carefully, never in too much detail. He doesn't seem to care for detail. You've never met the king. You're not even certain what he does, but you know his name, and you whisper it in your prayers, just in case it matters. Because out here, on the edge of the world, very little changes, and when it does, it's rarely for the better. Still, the hearth glows, the roof mostly holds, the cottage keeps you warm, and tomorrow, the same sun will rise over the same hills. For now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, but almost every one of them will be in circles. Most people in the medieval countryside never strayed more than a few miles from the place they were born. It wasn't because they lacked curiosity, or strength, or even footwear, though boots themselves were often a rare luxury. It was because the world beyond the next hill didn't feel like it belonged to them. To imagine going out to claim it, that was about as likely as sprouting wings and flying. From the time you were small, you learned every inch of land between your cottage and the far edge of the field. You memorized the twist of every tree stump on the way to the well. You could read footprints in the mud and tell exactly who had walked that path before you. But beyond that, everything became hazy. The next village might sit only 5 miles away, yet it felt like another country entirely. You'd heard the gossip about it. Who married whom? Who stole a goat? Which priest snored through mass? But you'd never seen the place with your own eyes, and chances are, you never would. Travel wasn't adventurous. It was dangerous, and not in the thrilling sense, but in the slow, exhausting, sometimes fatal kind of way. Roads weren't the neat paths you might picture today. No signs, no coaching inns, no friendly markers pointing the way. They were little more than ruts of mud, winding through forests, fields, and long stretches of empty land. Directions were vague. Walk until you reach the leaning pine, or turn left past the stone shaped like a sleeping pig. And on those tracks, there were three main things to fear. First, the forest. These weren't tidy woodlands for strolling. They were thick, dark, tangled with roots and undergrowth. Every sound seemed foreign, every shadow threatening. Wild boars, wolves, and sometimes people who would rather not be found. If you weren't born into the woods didn't want you. Second, bandits. Men and women with nothing to lose, no fields to till, no homes to anchor them. Travelers were easy targets. A man who walked with purpose might be assumed to have money. A woman alone might be assumed to be carrying something worth stealing. You learned quickly. Confidence was not protection. And third, getting lost. This wasn't a minor setback. If you wandered too far from the track, there was no one coming after you. Following a river downstream didn't guarantee safety. You could walk for days without meeting another living soul, disappear into the bracken, and it would be as if you'd never existed. People wouldn't even realize you were missing until a feast day rolled around. And when someone asked about you, someone else would simply shrug. Then came the practical obstacles. Who would tend your fields if you left? Who would feed the animals? What if the steward arrived while you were gone, ledger in hand, ready to collect the Lord's due? You couldn't offer curiosity as an excuse for unpaid taxes. Life didn't pause simply because you wanted to see what lay beyond the horizon. And even if you did make it safely to another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders carried risk, disease, crime, strange ways of thinking. You spoke with a slightly different dialect. You used unfamiliar phrases. Perhaps you even held your spoon differently. That was enough to mark you as other. Hospitality wasn't a given. Beds were already full. Food was always scarce. And suspicion was often more plentiful than kindness. The safest place was always home, not because it was truly safe, but because it was known. You understood which corner of the roof would drip during a storm, which hens liked to wander too far, and which neighbor might lend you a tool without asking for anything in return. Out there, beyond the trees, no one owed you kindness. Still, travelers did pass through from time to time, not peasants, rarely peasants, but merchants, monks, or messengers, people with purpose, protection, or both. You might see them once or twice a year, carts loaded with wool or barrels of salted fish, their words carrying tales, the way smoke clings to a fire. They spoke of cities where buildings were built of stone, where markets sold spices, where people walked streets that didn't turn to mud the moment it rained. It sounded like a dream, beautiful, impossible. You listened with wonder, but you didn't let yourself hope too hard. Because even if such a place truly existed, what would you do there? You couldn't read. You had no coins to spend. You wouldn't know the customs or the rules. A city could swallow you whole, and not a soul would ever know your name. So you stayed. Not only from fear, though fear had its place, but because there were always things to do, a fence to patch, a niece to watch over, barley laid out to dry, a dozen chores waiting to be finished before the sun dipped behind the trees. And maybe deep down, because you didn't need the world to be larger than the one you already knew. The village was enough. It had gossip and arguments, storms and sickness, and fleeting moments of joy. It had bells that marked the rhythm of days, seasons that turned without pause, and the quiet pride of making it through another year. Yes, sometimes you dreamed of what might lie beyond the woods, but most days, your only wish was that the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave, usually the desperate, sometimes the reckless, occasionally the ambitious. A young man might walk away chasing work, adventure, or a cause worth dying for. He might return with a limp or with a tail, or not at all. And when he didn't return, there were no long speeches, no endless questions, just a simple shake of the head and a quiet phrase. He went beyond the trees, as though that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was familiar. You weren't truly lonely. You shared your days with family, with neighbors, with animals, and with the land itself. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in the familiar grumblings of daily life. You didn't need to walk through a grand city to understand the worth of warmth. You didn't need cinnamon to savor sweet bread. You didn't need to cross a kingdom to feel love or grief or boredom or hope. And as the years passed, as aches settled deeper into your joints, and the children grew taller than the fence posts, the thought of travel faded, not with regret, but with acceptance. Some souls were meant to wander. Yours was meant to remain. There was no blueprint for home, no neat stack of timber waiting to be raised into place, just mud, wood, and whatever scraps the land hadn't already claimed. Your home wasn't a house, not in the way most might picture one. A house here isn't really a house the way you might imagine it. It's more of a truce between shelter and weather, effort and decay, between what you need and what the land reluctantly agrees to give. You start with a frame, rough timbers cut from the nearest woods, shaped with tools so old they've passed through more hands than anyone remembers. The beams aren't straight. They bend, they twist, they warp. But that doesn't matter. Neither do your walls. Once the frame stands, you weave slender branches or pliant sticks between the posts. It's called wattle, not graceful, not quick, but it holds well enough anyway. Like most things in your life, it's imperfect, but functional. Then comes the dog, a mixture of mud, straw, manure, and water. You slap it on with your hands, pressing it into gaps, smoothing it just enough to keep out the wind, and to convince yourself it looks intentional. It dries slowly, cracks in the sun, flakes off in chunks that you patch again before winter. At first, the smell clings to you. Eventually, you stop noticing. The roof is thatch, bundles of dried straw, packed thick and lashed to the beams. When new, it glows golden, almost beautiful. But then come the rains, then the birds, then the years. The color dulls, the edges unravel, holes open where you least expect them. Buckets appear in corners you'd hoped would stay dry. You don't replace it. You just keep patching until the roof is more repair than thatch. Some days you wonder if it might be easier to crawl beneath a cart. The floor is dirt. You tell yourself it's firm, and in places it is. Years of facet steps, sweeping, and spills have tamped it almost solid. But when it rains, the earth softens. When it freezes, it cracks. And when goats share the space for the night, well, best not to think too hard about what's underfoot. Sometimes you scatter straw or rushes across it. That helps for a while, until the straw dampens, darkens, and crumbles back into dust. Then you sweep it out, spread more, or simply accept that the straw has become the floor. Windows, if you can call them that, are just gaps in the wall, shuttered with uneven boards that never quite close. Glass is far too costly, too fragile, too rare. So the wind slips in, cold slips in, the bleating of animals slips in, and sometimes the animals themselves. There's a single door, always a little crooked, hanging off kilter because the frame shifted in the last hard frost. It closes with a wooden peg or hook, not to guard against thieves, since there's nothing worth stealing, but to keep the chickens in and the weather out. Inside, space is shared. One room, maybe two, if someone's managed to tack on a loft or lean-to, but usually just one. Here, you eat, cook, mend, argue, rest, and hope. Parents, children, grandparents, cousins, maybe even a neighbor's child whose parents are sick or gone. Everyone fits inside, somehow. At the center is the hearth, stone, if you're lucky, clay if you're not. Smoke curls upward through a hole in the roof, more or less. There's no chimney. The air inside is always smoky, always damp, always carrying the heavy scent of stew reheated for the third or fourth time. Furniture was scarce. A table, a bench, maybe a stool, if your family was particularly skilled or especially lucky in marriage. You might even own a carved chest. Beds were wooden frames stuffed with straw. Sometimes feathers of fortune smiled. They were shared, they creaked, and the blankets were wool, heavy, scratchy, and never quite dry. The rafters doubled as storage, strings of garlic and onions, bundles of herbs, maybe, on a good year, a ham tucked away from a slaughtered pig. The air above your head told its own story, the fullness of early winter, the emptiness of late spring. Sometimes that smell was reassuring, sometimes it was a warning. Animals weren't just nearby, they were inside. A cow might sleep in the corner, chickens scattered underfoot, a goat tied against the wall. It wasn't clean, it wasn't comfortable, but it was warm. You learned to ignore the clucks, the shuffles, the sudden startled bleat in the middle of the night. They blended into the background, like the whistle of wind, through thatch or the long creak of shifting walls. Nothing was level. The roof sagged, the floor dipped, the walls bulged, as though the whole house breathed in and out with the seasons. You fixed what you could. You ignored what you couldn't. Every spring you swore you'd repair the back wall. Every autumn it still leaned. These houses weren't built to last forever, only to survive the next storm. And yet, despite the flaws, and there were plenty, it was home. You knew where the cold seeped in and which sack to press against it. You knew which beam was strong enough to hold the cooking pot and which one groaned if someone leaned too close. You knew how the sunlight angled through the slats in the late afternoon and where the dog curled up when the fire grew low. Strangers saw poverty. You saw work, reuse, ingenuity. A roof that hadn't collapsed was a triumph. A fire still burning at dawn was a blessing. A single dry corner was worth more than gold. And when you lay down at night, surrounded by snores, smoke, and straw, you felt a quiet kind of comfort. Not pride exactly, but presence. This was your place. It bent, it leaked, it shifted in the wind, but it held. And so did you. For the average medieval peasant, food wasn't an experience. It wasn't colorful, varied, or even reliably hot. It was a problem, one you solved again and again with the same handful of ingredients, the same weary hope that something edible might come of it. Your kitchen, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a corner near the hearth. There were no pantries, no shelves lined with spices, no sunlit rows of jars, just a pot, a fire, and whatever hadn't spoiled. At the center of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of eternal stew that never really ended. It was never entirely new and never entirely gone. You added to it throughout the day. You skimmed it at night. You kept it warm through the seasons, and you prayed nothing unpleasant decided to grow in it while your back was turned. What went into it depended on what you had, and usually what you had wasn't much. On a good day, pottage might hold cabbage, leeks, a handful of barley, and a few beans. If the season was kind, maybe some garlic or onions. In the winter, it was dried peas, or whatever legumes survived the storehouse. And if fortune truly smiled, a scrap of salted pork might be tossed in, though more often it was just the bone. Even that was precious. You could boil a single bone for days, coaxing out the faintest memory of meat. The flavor was always the same, earthy, gray, more heat than taste. You didn't eat pottage because it was good. You ate it because it was there. A hot bowl at the end of the day wasn't a luxury. It was survival, a quiet victory. The pot itself was never really clean. You wiped it, maybe scraped it, but you rarely scrubbed it. Each new batch carried the shadows of the last, with no spices to hide the dullness, no vinegar to brighten the broth. It became a steady, stubborn flavor, like boiled history. Bread was the other staple, not soft, golden, or fragrant, just dark, dense, and heavy. It was made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the white and airy kind, belonged to the wealthy. Peasants could barely afford to look at it, let alone eat it. The loaves you had were small, hard, and quick to crumble. Leave one overnight, and it could double as a weapon. Still, it filled your stomach and gave you something to dip in the stew. At times, the bread was stretched with whatever was at hand, chaff, ground peas, or the sweepings from the bottom of the miller's barrel. In the harshest years, even that ran short, and people turned to tree bark. Not metaphorically. They scraped the inner bark, ground it, and mixed it with flour to make famine bread. Bitter, heavy, barely food, but just enough to keep you alive. When flour was scarce, trenchers took its place. These were slices of stale bread used as plates. They soaked up the stew and were eaten at the end, or tossed to the animals. Sometimes they were handed down the table to someone lower in rank, a hierarchy carved out of bread. Protein was rare. Chickens gave eggs. Cows gave milk. You didn't eat the animals unless you had to. When you did, nothing went to waste. Meat, fat, organs, bones, every part had a purpose. Blood went into puddings. Fat was rendered. The head became soup. Pork was the most common when it could be spared. Pigs were efficient animals, and their salted fat could turn a thin stew into something almost pleasant. But slaughtering a pig wasn't casual. It meant weeks of salting, hanging, boiling, and storing. Fishing was possible if you lived near water, but not always allowed. Rivers and lakes often belonged to the local lord, and casting a line without permission could cost you dearly. If you managed it, the catch was usually eels or small river fish, the kind that spoiled quickly. Salted herring was a treasure if you could find it. The church dictated much of the diet as well. Meat was forbidden on Fridays and during Lent, which meant fish or nothing. In some cases, loopholes appeared. Beaver tails, for instance, were reclassified as fish, a clever theological trick few argued against, since it meant more food on the table. Milk was common, but it spoiled quickly. To make it last, you churned it into butter or pressed it into cheese. Butter was a luxury used sparingly. Cheese was dry, sharp, and long-lasting. A few good rounds meant the cow had been generous that year. Still, dairy was risky. Sour milk was used anyway. Butter went rancid. Cheese molded. You just cut away the worst spots and hoped your stomach was stronger than the rot. Life for the medieval peasant was not grand. It wasn't gilded halls or banquets piled high. It was mud underfoot, smoke in your lungs, and the quiet rhythm of days that blurred into seasons. There was work without end, fields to till, animals to tend, roofs to patch, stew to stir. It was small, often harsh, but it was also steady, and within that steady life there was meaning. A roof that didn't fall in was a triumph. A loaf of bread was a treasure. A warm fire on a cold night was a miracle. You didn't need castles or cathedrals to find purpose. You found it in survival, in family, in the familiar faces around your table. To outsiders, it might look like poverty, but to those who lived it, it was simply life, imperfect, fragile, and yet deeply human. So the next time you hear about knights and kings and the grandeur of the Middle Ages, remember the peasants, the ones who stayed, who endured, who built their days out of mud and barley and smoke, because without them, there would be no stories of kingdoms at all.